Hey everyone, really excited to be here. My first RSA conference, so be nice to me when you see me outside of this talk. My name is Andrew Cameron. I'm the lead technologist for Identity and Access Management at General Motors. I am accompanied by
Razi Rais. I'm a senior product manager at Microsoft Security team.
So basically, disclaimer-wise, I'll shorten this out. You don't have to read it. Much of what we're bringing here is opinion. Don't hold the companies that we work for accountable for anything that we say. These are recommendations and guidance, and take it as much. Right? Okay, so we're going to go into kind of a use case around GM's experience in building and partnering with Microsoft in building a consumer identity platform. We're going to have some history, and I'll provide the boring business case stuff, and then Razi's going to dazzle you with demos and screens of Microsoft Entra capability. But in short, we really want to be able to identify and building and extending consumer identity services is something that all of you are probably in your companies are engaged with in some point or another. I just want to bring some of the issues that we've dealt with in our journey, and hopefully, some of the solutions that we incorporated, and then that would resonate with you, right? We're just trying to share and provide a best practices perspective on what our journey was. And also, we want to dive into more technical detail around, what's involved in actually defending these architectures, right? All of us are aware of how much our public-facing services are under attack on a daily basis. We want to get into understanding what defense in depth really is and some of the tools that are available to kind of help protect your architectures in that way. All right. Okay. So I'm going to dive into our use case. I'm going to get into first. I want to cover kind of an important concept to understand is that consumer identity and workforce identity are distinct, should be managed separately, and there's a few reasons for that. I mean, if you can find plenty of evidence for this publicly, but kind of four main themes on why consumer and workforce identity are separate and why they need to be managed separately. First of all is around identity creation, right? So if you think about all of your public-facing services, those are mainly self-service. If one of your customers signs into one of your services, they're creating their own identity in your platform. They're creating their own credential. They're providing their own profile attributes, and that's largely kind of what public-facing B2C identity services do. On the workforce side of it, obviously, there's a whole lot more involved in provisioning a user, assigning entitlements within your enterprise, and enabling them to leverage your internal business system. So those two facets of identity are actually very different when it comes to consumer and workforce identity. Another huge difference these days gets around identity proofing. When you are trying to prove or validate that someone is who they are, you will likely have much more stringent controls on the workforce side than you would on the B2C side, right? So on the workforce side, you may have the ability to incorporate liveness checks, document validation, where someone who is working with your company provides documentation for who they are. On the consumer side of that, that really provides friction to generally the experiences, and you're trying to avoid that. There are ways to do that on the B2C side where you're driving more of a progressive profiling approach to building an identity profile and allowing a customer to provide information in order to access other aspects of the experience that you're providing. So identity proofing is likely less friction causing on the consumer side, but there are some technologies, and we'll get into some of them, where you can do kind of the bot detection, you can do some of the threat detection, because there's a lot of that happening on the internet today, right? There's always some kind of an automated attack coming at your infrastructure, so you want to understand how best to prevent that. Just from a business focus, obviously, when you're dealing with workforce identity, the focus really is around security. On the B2C side, security is a high value and it's a high priority as well, but there is a balance needed, and I'll get into more detail about that balance and the aspects of that balance. But when you're dealing with kind of what the business priorities of identity are on workforce versus consumer, it's actually a lot easier to deal with on the workforce side, but when it gets into the consumer experiences, you're trying to enable as much security as possible without breaking the user experience, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of work that has to go into not throwing MFA prompts and not throwing challenges to the customer during your customer experience. And then those are things that you don't mind doing as much on the workforce side, right, if you're protecting your assets. And obviously, when it comes to branding, a huge focus on the B2C side on making sure that your identity experiences are branded in a way that allow access to other brands or other assets within your enterprise. In our case, we're multi-branded, but I'll get into, we focused on providing a single identity platform, a single identity experience that gives access to multiple brands, multiple channels, and that actually ended up being a huge benefit for our app owners in our business, where they didn't have to worry about building identity experiences, building account management experiences into their systems. They leave that to us, and they focus on building whatever it is that they enable the business with. Right? So that's, on the workforce side, there's not much in terms of branding that you need to worry about, and obviously that's another huge difference between the two. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot more into a little bit of deeper technical detail when it comes into how you protect your clients. And at this point, we're all doing modern auth, right? We're not doing legacy auth. You know, everyone's moved beyond passwords, right? I'm sure you have. But if you haven't, you should be driving towards leveraging the protocols. You know, SAML's still used, and we understand that. But to get the best security benefit, you should be driving towards OpenID Connect with the PKCE extension. That's really what, especially when it comes to mobile apps, mobile solutions, that you really should be driving towards as you build out and secure your clients. OAuth 2.1 is now a couple of years old now, and there's a lot of great guidance that you need to be following when it comes to how to implement OAuth and how to transition from authentication to authorization in your architectures. You should obviously be following that as sort of overall guidance in how you implement your solutions. And how do you say passkeys without actually using the word passkeys? That's how you do it. FIDO and WebAuthn are pretty much required tools in your toolbox these days, and I won't go into a lot about that. You're going to hear a whole lot about passkeys at probably a lot of other sessions this week, but I will endorse them just like everyone else will. The passkeys, I believe, are one of the most significant advancements in user security technology in probably the past 10 years, and they are ready and have been proven, where all of the large vendors have thrown support behind it. It is time to start using it in our solutions. I'll have a little more discussion around kind of, many of you in the identity community are familiar with Ian Glazer. I would recommend that you check out, he has a talk around ceremonies, and that gets into basically all of the experiences that can be brought to bear when it comes to transitioning from logging in to entering a password or providing a credential. It's actually an interesting, thought-provoking discussion, but the point of that is that identifier first, kind of separating the user ID and the password, is kind of essential to be able to move towards a passwordless existence. And I highly recommend that you move to that, and whether it's email or you might use some other identifier to identify your customers, being able to kind of separate that and provide more of a flowed experience is highly recommended. Razi will get into, and I want to highlight as well, the importance of enabling risk-based challenges, risk-based adaptive access in your solutions. There's a lot of interesting advancements in terms of what the cloud identity platforms are able to provide, what tools like Microsoft Azure B2C and Entra are able to provide. Being able to set policy based on risk and being able to challenge and enforce protection of your solutions based on risk is something that you most definitely want to start to look into and be able to leverage that capability in the solutions that you're using. And it's also obvious that you can't really have a B2C facing solution without being able to support federated logins, without being able to support allowing your customers to bring their own identity to your solution. So that means whether you support Google login or whether you support Apple login. I think the advice here is you don't want to have sort of too many options that you want to provide the customer. It ends up providing more of a confusing experience. You might want to focus on just a few of the leading providers, whether it's Google, Apple, Microsoft. If you get into more of those, it can provide a confusing login experience if you provide 10 buttons to do federated logins. Just keep that in mind as you enable federated logins. And another huge recommendation here when it comes to client-side security is that behavior analytics is something that is going to be essential in understanding how you secure the client, right? This week and wherever else that you may hear a lot of identity-focused discussions, you'll hear the term ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response. And if any discussion around zero trust, it really gets into understanding signals, right? And being able to process and respond to signals in your environment. We've been actually heavily been using behavior analysis. For example, when we deploy updates to our login experience and our mobile app, we're getting analytics based on any interaction that the user has. And it actually gives good insight to what the users are experiencing, right? It actually tells us if the users are falling off of a screen when they're getting an MFA challenge, or how we should respond to some of the interactions that a user is having within an application. You should make significant investments in understanding your analytics and use that to provide value to your backend systems. Okay, so I talked earlier about kind of the balancing act between the business and the security folks. I am a security. I am a converted identity security guy, and I spent most of my years outside of the security organization in General Motors, and then we've been reporting up to the CISO probably the last 5 years. There's a discussion in the identity community around the term Chief Identity Officer and whether that's something that should be a thing or not. I have opinions on that. I don't want to give a hot take in this session, but it is something that I believe identity and security are kind of naturally bonded in their objectives, right? And I think identity is much more relevant in the security organization. But when it comes to understanding how to kind of get that balancing act between usability and security, there's a lot of concerns that need to be brought to bear. In our case, we were migrating from a legacy platform and moving that into the cloud. So we were focused on making sure that we didn't break our user experience, but we wanted to be able to gain the benefits of security benefits of the new platform that we were migrating to in terms of what Azure B2C provided. So things like compliance and being able to implement fraud detection were huge with us. And so that's part of the benefit that you add that to your security focus. I'll get into a bit about our security, how we secure customer information. We took an approach where we didn't put all of our customer information in the cloud. We decided to split that concern and to manage some of that on-premise as well. And obviously the protecting of assets is really important. And then all of the other aspects that are important around usability. And you may not be surprised to hear that the business can be very protective around that experience. So when it comes to things like introducing MFA, when it comes to things like adding additional challenge to the experience, we had many, many discussions in order to kind of make sure that we were getting the right priority set when we were transitioning legacy login methods from our mobile app into using a modern auth approach. So that's something that obviously that you'll be want to be very aware of as you transition into implementing advanced security in your applications. And so and you have different concerns when it comes to that, right? You have retention is a high concern when it comes to implementing usability in your user experiences. So those are just things that you want to make sure that you're aware of. Okay, so when it comes to, and now I'm pivoting back to more of kind of what our concerns around and how we transitioned our perspective on enabling our customers from a product first to a customer first perspective, right? So initially we were very focused on selling a car, right? If you bought a car, that's great. We'll manage you as an owner of a vehicle, and we'll allow you to get access to your vehicle if you were in our rewards program, if you used any other services that GM provided. Maybe you might have had an integrated experience, maybe you didn't, right? And that was one of the major themes of our migration, was to be able to move from just people who own cars to people who are our customers. And so that was a huge focus for us, to be able to say that this is a customer. Not only do they own vehicles, not only are they in our rewards program, but they could be leveraging other services. They could be leveraging our energy services, for example. We have a significant energy business, and they could be leveraging other things that General Motors provides, and we would need to have a full 360 view of that customer and all their interactions with GM. So that was where a major focus came in, to say, not only do we care that, obviously we still care very much that they're buying our vehicles, but we want to understand and be able to provide them an experience that encompasses everything that they do with us, right? And to be able to increase our ability to retain them. So that's where identity is, it's that gateway to interacting with them, right? It's that their first experience when they buy a car and you fire up a mobile app in your nice new EV, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get a challenge to log in, right? The first thing, your very first experience that they have with you is something that's providing a login and a password experience, or a login and an MFA experience. So you want that to be as crafted as possible. You want that to be as secure as possible, right? And so that's why our focus and our goal in this transition was to be very heavily customer focused. And so that focus ended up transitioning into our applications. And what we were very focused on from our applications is that we had, on the left side here, there's a set of channels. If you consider that we had a web channel, we had applications running in our vehicles, and we had a mobile application. They all were implementing login separately, right? They all were implementing login and password changes separately. So when it came, we had to update password policies. We had to make some kind of a security update that affected our customer logins. We would have to hit each one of these channels individually to be able to affect some kind of change. But our goal in migrating to a cloud identity platform was to be able to consolidate and create a single control plane for not only login, not only for profile-based, policy-based protection that we were implementing using the Azure B2C platform, but now we were enabling our applications to kind of just move authentication off of their plate, right? They don't have to worry about it. They can focus on leveraging our service. And now we provide a common login experience. We provide a common MFA experience. We provide a common account management experience. And those are things that our application teams didn't have to worry about anymore. One of the last things I wanted to cover is our implementation of profiles. So we built a customer profile service that was dedicated and is still running in our data centers, separate from the cloud. I wanted to highlight that this is still, and a lot of you, too fast. A lot of you will look into kind of building out the profile management capability that are in the cloud solutions, and there's nothing wrong with that. We had goals of trying to keep our customer information kind of separate and secured on premise, not to say that the cloud is not as secure, but we decided to allow our applications to now not only worry about identity or authentication features, but now we can create profile as a service itself. And now when applications with new services come and are being built, they can plug into authentication, they can plug into authorization, and they can plug into a common set of profile services because they're providing the same experience to all of our customers, right? And so now separating out profile is one of those ways we accomplish that. So we kept our identity directory very light, not a lot of profile attributes that are in our identity directory. But I wanted to highlight this as one of the ways that you can also manage it. You can keep them all in a single repository in the cloud, or you can choose to manage them separately. In wrapping up, and I want to dive into this a bit because this, I wanted to highlight some of the core requirements and some of the things that were important to us in our journey. Obviously, I've talked about the benefits of single identity, right? The benefits of when your customer comes to your service, they don't have to worry about how many logging into using different accounts to access the service. There's one identity, one account, and that's all they need to access your service. Focusing on frictionless, focusing on not creating barriers to leveraging your experience is very important. And so being able to provide, so that feature that you get out of that is that you provide a common account management experience, right? And that was something that we were able to do with our customers. Make sure that it scales. Obviously, when you move to the cloud, you get all of those benefits, and Razi will give you all of that. And also something that's kind of really important, really something that needs to have a separate focus is around preference management. And it's separate from profile management. If you think about profile management being data that identifies your customer, preference management is data that is used to craft your customer experience, privacy information, aspects of the experience that the customer wants maintained whenever they come back. And you'll start to see in a lot of the cloud identity solutions, you'll start to see a dedicated preference management capability where that can be leveraged by your solutions as well. And so that highest level of kind of customization and personalization is where you're providing a custom preference management solution as well. So I think I am ready to turn this over to Razi. More cool car pictures, but I'll turn it over to Razi.
Yeah. I'm also not opera, so I'm not able to give you that, but it's a nice visual. So when Andrew was covering the architecture and some of the decisions, one of the things that we identify over the years rolling it out is you need to have a fundamental building blocks, and there has to be a process in place. Now, one of the things that is challenging is such a rapid changing environment in the cybersecurity that you're always going to have challenge keeping up. So we basically shrink it down into 4 things, and you will see that in the consumer or customer identity space, if you map into these 4, they basically give you the best results. And again, this is something that we've been doing for a while now, so you can a little bit see the results. I will walk through some of the demos. The first one is really establishing the intent. As Andy was mentioning, that there's a difference between workforce and customer identities. One of the things is that most of the time the customer identities are self-initiated, so you don't really know until you know. So I think establishing an intent is very important. So you really wanted to ask why this request is coming in, and you have to have like a zero trust mindset that you verify everything that's coming in, or stop right there. The other thing is establishing a proof. That's where the identity proofing comes in. So now you have identity, but okay, it's not maybe a bot, but who exactly that identity is, like what that particular user is trying to achieve. So it's basically assertion at that point. I will show you some examples of that, how you can do it at a scale. While you're doing all that, one of the key things to do is monitor everything, including from the user side, the user analytics, and also what's happening in terms of the behavior of each request. There is sort of like a challenge. I mean, when you look at any API or website with a high throughput, we're talking about like millions of MAU, then incident versus having the early warning signals, I think that's a good differentiator. So you don't want everything to be an incident, but you do want early warning signals to show up. So we'll talk about that, how you can do that in the platform. And finally, orchestrate. So this one is critical because when you are detecting what's going on in the environment, you do want it to have an automation in place to react. Now, how do you react? I will show you some examples. You just wanted to have that Goldilocks effect, because if you react too soon, too much, it's a little bit more on the edge. If you react less, then you probably have some threat there that you're not mitigating. So let's take a little bit more concrete example here, right? Like what actually happens when the request comes in. So the request comes in, we don't know anything about the request at that point in time. So the first thing you want to do is that you wanted to apply the security controls right at the edge. So this is where the CDN is, this is where your web application firewall is. This is where you're basically going to stop the most prevalent attacks. This is the bot protection, this is the DDoS attacks, this is your top threats that exist, right? Now this is far from your actual API, this is important. So you wanted to do this very, very far from your actual API space or the website or whatever you have. And that's where you're actually going to do the second round. So the whole concept here is that at every layer have the defense. That's the whole idea. And you will see the same concept apply again and again. Again, this is something that you can apply in a vendor agnostic fashion. Of course, if you have a platform, in Entra, we have a full holistic support for it. The thing is that once you actually go through the entire cycle and you have the token issued, the threat actually don't go away, right? There's a token replay attack. You still need to make sure that the token is verified. So you do all this, and you see at the bottom there is this seam and the sore. So it's basically there by the time the request actually came in and by the time you actually get the token. And you can actually also doing it on the application side. So you have 360-degree view at all times what's going into your environment. So at any given point in time, you should be able to comment on the security posture with a degree of assurance. Now, how this maps the building blocks, just to give you some visual aid here, this is where you're establishing the intent. So WAF is absolutely like, I mean, next generation web application firewalls are absolutely great in doing this. So this is where you're going to vet out everyone and any request that is not establishing the intent that actually is malicious. So you're basically doing that. The next step is basically establishing the proof. At every step, you're proving, you're verifying what and who you are. And at this step, you should have more assertion about the identity. If you don't, then you should stop and do something about it. And you're basically doing the continuous observe and orchestrate. Now, how you actually do it at a scale. So I'm going to go into that a little bit now. The first thing that we realize is if you go today and just, it doesn't matter, it has to be like a GMS scale or not, and put anything out there in a public, the first thing you're going to run into is the malicious bot-based attacks, DDoS, fraudulent requests, you name it. And they are really, really sophisticated. So just to give you some idea what you're going to face with on a day one if you don't plan for this, you're going to have a DDoS, we all know that. Fraudulent account creation, that basically going to lead to a very critical problem in the business, which is the inflated MAU. Your business could not able to react to a simple query like what is actually the business traffic looks like. You're probably going to have millions of MAU, but again, how much of that is an effective MAU? MAU is monthly active user, so that's very important for the business. There are other issues, subscription abuse, for example. We see that bots coming in, creating subscription, so you need to go and verify again what that subscription looks like, why did it exist. This is a problem that need sort of like a multi-layer defense. So the first thing you do is you have a web application firewall that vet out all the bots. That's number one. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. Some of them are going to seep into the other layer. That you're going to do the adaptive authentication. This is where you're validating and verifying the identity. This is where the MFA, phishing resistant MFA, are going to come into the place. Typically, what you want to do during the sign up, this is again a sign up problem. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, like what we learn about it. Identity proofing. So identity proofing is really the difference between that and putting just a WAF is the synthetic identities that are coming in, they can not be a bot. They can be someone human coming in, and they can literally create a synthetic identity. They can steal your first name, last name, address, someone else SSN, and then they can come in. So how do you do that? For that kind of a fraud to stop, you have to have an identity proofing in place. Now, depending on the industry and depending on the risk associated with that, you probably wanted to tune in like how much and where you are doing it. Typically, having a device fingerprinting with a backend service, the end is the best combination. We saw that produced the best results. And then finally, all the signals into the monitoring. So here's a sort of like an example here that how to protect the signups with the fraud protection, right? So there are two things that we observe that happen a lot. And the first one is just the fraudulent account creation. This is where you're basically going to go in and then have this millions of accounts being created by the bots. They're extremely efficient, so you're basically going to run into that on a day one. The other one that maybe some of you aware of this is called the IRSF attack. It's the International Revenue Shared Fraud. It's a highly effective attack, and it's a very easy to perform attack. So what happens is that there would be what they call like a premium phone numbers. You can actually have that phone number, and at the time of the sign up, you're basically going to use that as a MFA. Now, if you have the old PSTN-based SMS or phone, this is going to cause your business and the downstream customers a huge impact. Because what happened is that if the regular cost of an MFA phone call SMS is, let's say, a couple of cents, this call going to cost you a couple of dollars. This is like a 50x, 100x the ratio. And there's very little you can do if you don't plan for it. And you don't even find it until it happens. So that's an attack that you definitely wanted to, in the customer identity space, you need to ready for this attack, right? So how do you mitigate that? What you do is a combination of things. The goal here is that you stop the malicious activity far from where the action is taking place. So the first layer should be the web application firewall. Majority of these attacks are led by bots. Now, let's say you're not a bot, you're performing still some synthetic operation. Then there should be a fraud protection in place at the time of sign up. If you stop it at the sign up, actually you safeguard your sign-ins later on. So that's important. The other thing, which is actually really, really important, is move away from this classic like PSTN-based phone and SMS, if you can. And I will show you an example, like what we're doing with GM to achieve that goal. So these are sort of like the combination. And again, a lot of people ask me that, can we just have one? And you can have one, but the reality is that your security posture will jeopardize, right? You have to do multiple things, and you have to learn by looking into where the gaps are. So here's a sort of like a example, from a bot management standpoint, right? Some of the lesson learned was that your business may be global, like General Motors is global, right? But the amount of requests you are getting from different regions and countries, you can look into historically and put some limits on that, right? So you can do that. You can look at the different geo, you can look at different type of behavior, and you can put constraint. You can block requests from certain regions. In extreme cases, if you're seeing a lot of malicious traffic coming in, you can do that. So the product that you're using should able to have this, like literally just go there, able to configure. You should able to do it like automation. You should able to do it easily. This is the infrastructure as code example. And again, you should able to do it in a vendor agnostic manner. The other thing that we realize is that once you even stop the bots, the other thing is the user identity itself. And this is where Entra has a full identity protection based on the ML, machine learning. So once you are in, we can tell by looking at the attributes at scale. It's like an N by M matrix, right? We are using the machine learning to detect what behavior this identity has. And when you find a behavior which is anomalous in nature, right, you basically assign a risk. So the idea here is that not to completely stop the user getting in. The idea is to make that call in a smart fashion. Because again, as Andy was talking about it, right, there's a balance between security and usability. If you go on one side, it's like an oscillation factor, right? Then you're completely going to impact the usability of it. So here's an example of a policy that you can set up in the Entra, right? And this is what we are doing at a scale. So what we do is that there's a sign-in risk. It's calculated at runtime for every single request. It will tell you the risk associated with that particular request, high, medium, and low. And what you can do on top of that is something depending what you wanted to do in terms of having a security posture, right? You can ask, for example, enforce the multi-factor authentication for that particular request. If the request is being consistently coming from that particular identity has been malicious, then you can basically ask them to change the password, or you can even block the particular user activity. So that is important. The other thing that we realize is what Andrew was talking about earlier is different demographics have different needs. So you will have people who definitely going to gravitate towards the existing like SMS and phone, and we talk about the security risk associated with that. So what we do is that we provide them the option. So you can see at the bottom, there's the option that basically we recommend, and it's the opt-out thing. So if you're creating an identity, by default, is going to be phishing resistant like authenticators, a TOTP, right? So that's the MFA method that we recommend. Now, again, there would be certain percentage of the demographic that may not able to use it for definitely usability reasons, some legal reasons. So you need to provide the option on the table. The more important thing is that when you talk about the accessibility, it should be easier to use them. So the user interface, the user analytics, that report that we get, we tune the user interface. It's literally a continuous loop. You learn what's working, you come back, you improve. But the idea is that you can show banners, you can have some sort of like incentives to move from SMS to authenticator TOTP. So again, it's not an ideal world, so we still feel that there's a lot to be done, but this way we managed to achieve some success People are more receptive to the ideas when things are easier versus like you just force them to do it. So here's an example of the report. Again, this is from our sample site, not the actual GM data. This is like the sign-in happening, and then these are the geolocations. And what you can do with this kind of a data is you can double click on it. That's very effective for the SOC team. So you can see, well, there's a pretty much of a hike of a sign-in happening at a particular time. I'm just interested in the third row, for example, that what's happening here. There's a combination of unfamiliar like features and unlikely travel. So unlikely travel would be like I'm here right now in San Francisco, and next minute I'm basically signing in from Seattle, and next minute I'm signing in from somewhere in Dubai. So that will be very much like an unlikely travel, right? So that's the machine learning based system doing the job. But in addition to that, we also observe that the features, for example, your browser or your activity that is happening is not familiar to us, right? So it will basically tag that, and then you can double click on it. You can go in and see, okay, so what was that activity? So you double click on it, you will send the details here. So I just redacted some of the details here, but it's basically going to give you the geolocation with the IP address, the identity, the location, everything. And then you can also see what happened with that request. Again, this is a little bit of a spot checking, but my point is that the tool should allow you to perform end-to-end activity analysis with ease. So that's very important, because at point in time is like you will find that users get stuck and things like that, and you need to find out like why, because things may not be working as expected. In this particular case, the risk was low, and then they managed to actually pass the conditional access and able to receive the token. Now just a word on the orchestration side and the observation side, right? So the way you want to do this is you wanted to bring in the data continuously. So there shouldn't be any gaps. So you collect the data, and then you find the threats that you are interested in, right? There's a lot of data. Typically, when you have a very high throughput website like, or API endpoints like GM, you just cannot just look at everything. So you need to be a little bit more surgical with it, and I will show you an example. When you investigate, that's where you actually tune in. So the tool should be able to give you all the right ways to do it. I'll show you an example of that, and then you respond. So how do you respond? It really depends. So I think what we're learning is that having an automated response in place is absolutely critical, but you also don't want to overdo it. So there is again, a human element involved there. So here's a good example. So this is an example of the attack that I was talking about. So this is the IRSF attack, right? So you can see that this is from our site that we provide to the customers to play with the platform and enter external ID. And you see that right over here at this stage, there is the sudden influx of the requests. Now what are these? Someone, basically a bot, getting in and try to sign up. And what they are doing is they're trying to sign up, but the attack doesn't require them to complete or finish the SMS MFA. So what you do is that you put the phone number in, get the call or the SMS going, and that's it. They achieve their target, right? Because they cause the downstream service a damage. So it's a pretty high index over here, right? So what you do is you double click on this and you say, well, I wanted to have an alert and I wanted to react to it like immediately. So how do you do that? So in the platform, what you can do is that you can go back here. You can define a rule that says that if the success rate of the MFA related to the PSTN-based telephony is dropping, the success rate is dropping below a certain percentage, I want to do something about it. Now at the bare minimum, you want to notify. So in this case, for example, the email, SMS, or you can have a webhook to whatever service you wanted to do that. But again, the important thing is that platform should be able to allow you these provisions very easily. So in this particular case, it's 95%. And again, you will ask like, how do you come to this number? The answer is the data will tell you. In any service, if you look at 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days, you should be able to say what is the average success and the failure rate without the attack. So sort of like that's how you get to that particular point. Now once you have that, then the next step is to basically go and create the alert. Now in this particular case, we are using the security language. People who are familiar with the Microsoft platform, there's a language that is used a lot in the Sentinel and Monitor. And we're defining and tuning in the alert, right? And what will happen is when you put it in place, it will give you this sort of like a protection. It will give you this sort of like indicator here that there's a trigger here, and the success rate dropped below the 95% potential attack. Someone need to look into it. Again, whether you want to create a full incident out of that, that's something that we work with the customers, but that the tooling should be there on a day one. And again, you wanted to refine this based on the actual investigation that you perform. Now, in terms of how do you respond, now this is really where you have to strike the balance. At the bare minimum, in the case of the IRSF attack, we wanted to make sure that the phone numbers being used should be blocked, right? So platform is going in and it basically blocking a particular phone number that is used as a reputation check. So it's doing that. On top of that, it's basically doing a temporal throttling for that particular user identity, because whatever accounts trying to be created, whatever attributes they're bringing in, they're definitely showing malicious activity. So we're going to do a throttling right there. Now, throttling doesn't necessarily mean it's forever. It's usually temporal until the traffic goes back to normal. But the more important thing is that the phone number that is used now cannot be repurposed, right? Because it's going to be blocked, so you cannot really use that. Now, this is the automatic. Now, what you do on top of that, that's something that's a little bit dependent on your organizational flow and how do you want it to do a next stage, right? Typically, it's also investigation, do we want it to block a particular region? Do we want it to look at the application? Why we are having that? But this should be automatic. You should not even be required to do the extra steps to get there. All right, so with that, Andrew, do you want to wrap up?
All right. Okay, so in wrapping up, fire hose of information, that's typically how these talks go, but engage your customers within your businesses and understand kind of the differences between your workforce and your consumer identity platforms, and start to work with your stakeholders to make sure that you understand how threat detection is integrated into your platform, right? Within this now, you should focus on understanding defense in depth and start to implement plans to make sure that you are incorporating the proper set of controls across all stages of your platform. So what Razi covered around establish intent, establish proof, make sure that you can understand the differences between those contexts across your architecture. And then obviously within 3 months, however long that takes, make sure that you can start to actually put hands on and do testing of these controls, whether it's WAF, whether it's your MFA controls, and definitely make sure you put in the effort to understand how to get these signals integrated into your SIEM platforms. That's a critical aspect of being able to respond and to make sure that you can take the proper action when you detect that kind of risk. And lastly, you focus on it's a constant improvement of maturity for all of those stages, and that's obviously something that you put into your continuous improvement processes to make sure that you're always upgrading and updating your threat detection capabilities. I think that is a wrap.
Yeah, we wanted to open for the Q&A now, so if you have any questions, you can come to the microphone and can ask. Go ahead.
This is Guru from Cisco. So a couple of questions here. What do you recommend? Domain-based, so when you do a federation with your partners, so you do a domain-based federation or an application-based federation?
I'd say it's typically application-based. You can enable federation to a domain, to a set of applications as well, as long as you have the single sign-on implemented. But typically, when it's consumer-facing, it's typically an application-based scenario. And again, I would say that answer depends on what your business requirements are around federation.
Okay, so you're saying in GE you did most of the integrations are application-based when it comes to federation? Is that how you?
Well, I would say that because you're integrating applications to a single identity provider, that federating to that identity service then gives you single sign-on to other applications that are shared with that identity provider, right? So you have that capability.
The challenges which we have faced is when you do a application-based federation, eventually for one particular application, the user is being sent back to the partner domain to get authenticated.
Yep.
But when it comes to other applications which the user accesses and says that, hey, I don't want federation for these apps, then you end up maintaining one more set of credentials for those applications.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, and you
So
want
I
to
just
avoid
wanted
that.
to know whether what
Yeah.
you recommend and what you have been doing. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. The other question I have is, what grant types are you particularly restricting within your organization today? Are there any particular grant types? Because you mentioned legacy systems, you mentioned Pixie-based flows. So I was just wanting to understand if you are restricting certain grant types. And I'll
Yes. I mean, the guidance is in alignment with what OAuth 2.1 recommendations are, and the two grant types basically are auth code flow and client credentials are the two that are recommended now. So like implicit flow now is not recommended, ROPC not recommended.
correct.
So,
So ROPC, you're restricting totally in your organization today?
we are rooting it out and extinguishing
it.
it, yes.
Okay, that's what we are struggling as well.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know whether you are recommending application teams to move over into a device-based authorization. People who, application teams who don't want to move over towards a Pixie-based flow, and they have been doing, the ROPC-based flows.
Yeah.
They have faced challenges, and I was just wanting to know what you folks did.
I would say that my comments around being part of the security organization and making the security imperative around implementing modern auth is kind of where that discussion should go.
Okay.
And sometimes you can make the business an offer they can't refuse. Let me put it that way. I understand that they have, and trust me, I've been in those discussions where they have desires to kind of maintain that password-based flow, but again, I think the security benefits of moving to modern auth are kind of pretty clear.
Okay, just last question. How do you manage entitlements for your application when it comes to external entities?
How do we say it again?
How do you manage entitlements
Yes.
for external entities?
It's a custom implementation. We manage basically groups and attributes, and we treat them as entitlements. And as the customer subscribes or accesses different services, then our systems, our platform enables them and manages that group membership or attribute based. It's both.
So bringing the external user entities into your AD groups vis-a-vis leaving the authorization to be left to the
Correct.
applications itself.
Correct.
Okay, so you,
Yeah, we don't have it's not a common authorization platform. It is a profile management, but externalizing authorization is a whole nother level of complexity. I'd like us to get there. That would be good. It would be good if we can get there. But.
wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. And
Thank you.
My name is Rhonda Simmons from New York Life Insurance Company. I have a question because you're recommending risk-based authentication, but the New York Department of Financial Services is kind of going to two-factor, I think, by the end of next year. What are you guys doing to prepare for that?
We from an enterprise perspective, multi-factor is required basically for everything. There is no for customers, yes, for customers as well. It's essentially we've eased it in from a opt-in to make it more mandatory, but yes, we believe that given the customer an MFA experience is pretty much a mandatory aspect of it.
Just a quick one on your use of OAuth. Are you guys looking at any protections for lift and shift of OAuth tokens like
Yes, constantly.
Depop?
A lot of work we're
I mean,
running.
I just, in reference to say the FAPI profile for OIDC, which uses either MTLS, which probably isn't appropriate for public clients like SPAs and mobile apps, but perhaps Depop, which can be programmed into those clients. Have you guys looked at that and are you using that at all?
Looked at it. If you, I have an Identiverse talk coming up, or I dive deeper into that. But yes, it is.
I'll see you there.
I did a little promotion there. But yes, it is something that token theft is a constant concern, right? And that's like Razi said, they're getting more and more sophisticated, and the more you protect it on the client, the better chance that you have.
Yeah, I mean, you could, I guess, in many ways, you could use your signals stuff to help mitigate like impossible travel and those types of things, but application level protection of lift and shift is of interest to me, and I just wondered if you're using it yet or not.
It is a hot area, and yes, very focused on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. With that, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoy the session.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.